Does anyone know? We're going to start with the first step. What is that at the bottom? A ceramic thing. Does anyone know?
Oh, that?
Yes.
Is that where you? I would have got
Chamber pot. Yes.
Okay.
So what do you collect? Do we know what we collect from the chamber?
Urine.
Yes.
Oh.
Great. So I'm pretty sure this is vinegar, but we're going to pretend.
Yeah.
So the first step with this is that you'd actually soak your linens. So anything that was heavily soiled, you'd put it in a pot with urine and water. So the ammonia kind of helps remove some of the stains. So that would be the first process.
Yes.
And then on Mondays was generally the wash day. And so that's when you would do your laundry. And so you'd have it soaking, right? And then after that, you'd wring it out, put it in a big pot over the fire with a little bit of soap, kind of boil it, kind of get that going, right? After that, you'd take it out and you'd spot treat it. So fabric was really expensive at the time period, but labor was cheap, right? So we don't want to wear out our fabric by scrubbing it like you see later. We want to be pretty gentle with it. Just a second. And then we'd take some soap. So in this case, hard soap we're using, but soft soap was more common. Soft soap was more like the consistency of like applesauce, a little bit thicker. And you'd actually scrub that in and kind of spot clean it. So once you're done with spot cleaning, what would you do, Brianna?
Oh,
You'd take it and you'd beat it to get all the soap out, right?
If only there was somebody here who could demonstrate.
I know. If only there was someone who could demonstrate. We can start with that. Can you show me? Can you hit this soap? Hit the thing?
Bang!
Bang, bang. So this would force kind of the water, the soap, and the dirt out of the laundry. So this was very common. So if we stop, we're going to flip it over, right? We flip it over. We're going to pretend this is wet today. So after she's done forcing all the soap and the dirt out, you'd rinse it, right?
Yep.
And then you'd hang it up to dry, right?
Did you do most of it outside?
So I was thinking about that. So on a day like today, I would not want to be, you know, your hands would get very cold. So I'd probably do it somewhere like this or in the kitchen, depending on that. In the summer, I would definitely do it outside. Yeah. And so after the laundry's wet, after you've washed it, you would hang it probably inside or outside, right? Because it does actually get dry in the winter, right, as well. So, and then the things that were most commonly washed, right? We all are wearing shifts for women. So that's our innermost layer, or shirts for the men. So that got commonly washed, right? Your caps would get washed, your handkerchiefs, and then your aprons, right? And your socks. So those are the things that would get washed. You'd also have your household linens, right? So that's another thing that would get washed.
So where would the soap come from?
Good question. Generally, most people made their own soap at the time period. So what you'd do is you'd save your ashes. You'd stack it in a barrel like this. You'd have ashes, straw, ashes, straw, ashes, straw. And you'd fill up that barrel with water. And that would leach kind of the hydroxide out of the ashes, and you'd collect what was left. And so in order to figure out if the concentration was correct, you'd take a fresh egg and you'd actually float it in the solution and see how much it floated. And so they said about the size of a quarter should float in a fresh egg. If it was too dense, it would sink, right? And so you'd either add more water to it to kind of dilute it, or you'd boil it over the fireplace to kind of more concentrate it. And so once you had that egg floating, which is a good measure of like the density, the concentration of it, you'd actually mix in your animal fat. And so that in this time period would be like pig or cow. You could also get some soap made out of olive oil, but that was imported, right? So that's not something that people would normally use. And so you'd collect your fat and you'd mix them together. And then you mix it together, and that would be your soft soap. So that's the kind of, we would store it in crocks. This is my next reenactor project, is to make soft soap, but you would store it in a jar and you kind of ladle out a glob of soap, and you'd mix it in with your laundry, right? Hard soap was made by adding salt in that process, but salt was more important for food preservation. So you're not going to add salt if you don't need to, right? And so if you had fancier soaps, some body soaps had salt added for fancier people, but most people would get by with soft soap. And so that's something that you would make in your household. You'd probably store in like a barrel like that and kind of decant it out. And I would probably do that in the fall, right? When I'm slaughtering animals for food preservation for the winter, I'd get my soap, I'd do it outside because it's hot, right? Lye is caustic, right? So it's not something I necessarily want to do in my house. And I have to get the proportions right.
So soap doesn't get rancid if it's made with that?
So if you do it correctly, it doesn't necessarily get rancid in the time you're using it. Yeah, but you do have to render your fat well. So you take your fat and you actually boil it over with a little bit of water over the stove. And it actually kind of, you separate out all the stuff you don't want. And you can do that multiple times to make it less rancid. I'm sure there were women who did this the first time and they were like, I did this terribly, my soap went rancid. Like, I'm sure that happened, right? And people were like, this smells terrible, it's very caustic, don't use her soap, it's terrible, right? But I think after a certain point, if it was handed down well, you would know, right? But the thing is, like, it could still be caustic, right? It's kind of not an exact science. So some people were probably really good at making soap and it was good for their body. Some people had leftover that was maybe too basic and it kind of irritated their hands. So there's probably a whole spectrum of soap makers. So at this time period, right, Knox is traveling along. There's no women in that party, right? So they're stopping at different towns for the night. They probably sent out their laundry, right? If they stayed in a place more than once, or kind of sent it home and got it back. But as they went on campaign, right, Washington recognized that they do need laundresses with the army, because originally men, they weren't washing their shirts, they were letting them kind of rot on their backs, which was disgusting, right? And so, or their socks, right? Shirts and socks, you don't wash any of them. After a while, your army's gonna smell pretty funky. So they recognized that they do need laundresses, right? And they were part of the support of the military, right, as they moved along campaign. And so they had set prices for different things. The commanding officers could talk to the laundresses and make sure they weren't price gouging people, right? Because you wanted the laundry washed, but you also wanted people to do your laundry, right? So it's a good relationship there. And they either had to provide soap to the laundress, or the laundress could charge them extra money for providing her own soap, right? So that was kind of part of the ways that it was the hard life. But if you can think about all the shirts and all the things that had to be washed while you're on campaign, it's a lot of stuff. And then everything in the time period, especially if you're doing group laundry, would be identified by your initials. So this is an example of, you'd have your initials embroidered for both shirts and shifts on your items, so that if you were doing group laundry, you could separate it. Because let's think about, fabric was expensive at the time period, right? So if you have 20 guys sending their shirts to the laundress, they have multiple shirts, right? How are you going to get them back, right? And so having your name either with initials embroidered, or these are kind of like cross-stitched, or you could have some inks that you could actually write indelible in the corner to kind of identify your clothing, because you wanted it back, right? You paid for your clothing, you wanted it back. And so normally you'd also probably have a number underneath about showing, okay, first, second, third, fourth, whatever. So you can kind of keep track that way as well. So even like George Washington, his household linens were generally embroidered with his name, with his initials, his actual linens itself, so you can kind of identify. And that was good for group situations, right? So as a laundress, if I followed the military, I would look over all the laundry, make sure it's in good repair anything I needed to, make sure whoever dropped it off had their initials so I could give it back to them, right? And be like, here is your shirt. I don't have to pay for the fabric myself, you know what I mean? So that was one way that you kind of kept track. And you can look in museum pieces, they still have initials on a lot of laundry. So it's pretty cool to kind of see, here's this person who had that.